Every single human that's ever lived has been limited to this one pale blue dot in a universe teeming with mystery and opportunity. In order to expand the scope of human consciousness, we must journey beyond the orbit of our planet and become multiplanetary. For a variety of reasons, the planet Mars is the next logical step in our cosmic journey, and will likely see the first human boot on Mars before the end of the decade. However, before we make the difficult journey to the red planet, there are a number of challenges that must be solved, and I'll talk about most of them in this video. This is not an exhaustive list, but I'll attempt to cover as much ground as possible. We'll talk about the transportation side, the hazards humans will face along the way, as well as what we'll need to do to ensure a return trip. Let's start with the very obvious first step, SpaceX's Starship rocket, which is likely to be the first rocket to get humans to Mars. The Starship system is most notably going to be the world's first rapidly and fully reusable orbital rocket, which, in Elon's words, is the fundamental technology revolution needed to make life multiplanetary. We're currently still waiting for the first orbital flight of the Starship system, consisting of the first stage named B4 and the second stage named S20. S20 recently underwent a cryo-proof test and is awaiting static fires along with B4, and we're still blocked on the FAA's environmental assessment of the launch site. However, B5 and S21 are already nearing completion, and the momentum at Starbase Texas doesn't seem like it's going to stop anytime soon. Once Starship is able to achieve orbit, re-entry, and landing, the next milestone for the program is orbital refueling. This is critical for getting a non-trivial amount of payload to the Moon or to Mars. A Starship in orbit can be fully refueled by launching special tanker Starships, which will rendezvous with a ship that's carrying payload. There are a lot of other details here like possible fuel depots, but that's out of scope for this video. SpaceX has a contract for a future crewed lunar mission with NASA. And assuming the Starship program is successful and NASA solves all of its equipment challenges, we should see an uncrewed lunar landing by SpaceX followed by a crewed lunar landing in collaboration with NASA, sometimes around 2025. Regardless of the lunar mission timeline, SpaceX could start sending some uncrewed Starships to Mars as soon as the orbital refueling milestone is met, possibly even with a few TeslaBot prototypes? At any rate, it'll certainly be important to test landing on Mars without humans on board for obvious reasons. In the most optimistic case, we'll probably see uncrewed missions in 2024 and crewed missions in 2026. But more conservatively, we will likely have human boots on Mars around the end of the 2020s, either thanks to SpaceX or China. So far, SpaceX has mostly focused on cargo missions, either for ISS resupply missions, third-party satellite launches, or launches for its own satellite constellation Starlink. But in recent years, SpaceX has begun performing crewed missions, and it currently has 4 such missions under its belt: Demo 2, Crew 1, Crew 2, and the recent flight that deservedly got a lot of attention, Inspiration 4. SpaceX has a bunch of planned crewed missions in the near future, including the Dear Moon project, which is planning to fly a crew of around 10 people in a trajectory around the Moon in 2023. These missions not only provide extra revenue, but they're an opportunity for SpaceX to refine its strategy and skill set when it comes to life support and astronaut quarters. While short-term missions may get by with tanks of compressed oxygen for breathing, a long-duration trip to Mars will most definitely require some active way of recycling the air. Water can be split into hydrogen and oxygen using electrolysis, and the hydrogen can be recombined with the carbon dioxide exhaled by humans using the Sabatier reaction to produce water and methane. A system like this already exists on the ISS, so the system should also work well on Starship in principle. Food storage and waste disposal and recycling have also been demonstrated on the ISS, and we'll gloss over these topics for brevity. There are still major unknowns when it comes to low gravity or microgravity effects on the human body. And while we have some data on the long-term impacts of microgravity from research done on the ISS, we don't really have any data about Mars gravity, which is around 38% that of Earth's gravity. We could in theory create rotating habitats that spin at a velocity that simulates Mars gravity so that we could begin to study the effects, but I'm not aware of any concrete plans for that yet. For the journey though, we could potentially tether 2 Mars-bound Starships nose to nose and spin them to create artificial gravity, although nothing's been announced about this part yet. One very relevant challenge the astronauts will face on their journey and during their extended stay is the psychological impacts of isolation from other humans. They'll need plenty of offline-friendly forms of entertainment and regular contact with friends and family back home, and until Mars's internet infrastructure is improved, possibly through Starlink, this will be quite a difficult problem, especially since Earth entertainment is trending more and more towards cloud-based, low-latency experiences. Let's talk a bit about the dangers of space. There are two types of radiation people usually talk about: solar radiation and galactic cosmic rays. The short version is that while radiation levels will certainly be higher during the journey than on most of Earth, with some shielding and clever arrangement of the crew, we can bring that down to the level of radiation experienced on the ISS. I've linked an article discussing the math and what safe radiation levels look like down in the description. One other interesting thing to note is that there's a city in Iran named Ramsar with similar radiation levels to what we'd experience on Mars. And there doesn't seem to be any increase in cancer rates among the local population. I've linked a video by Anton Petrov discussing this city and its implications on Mars colonization. In the case of a strong solar storm during the journey to Mars, the crew could utilize a small region in the center of the living quarters shielded by the mission's water and food supplies, according to an AMA with Dr. Robert Zubrin on the SpaceX subreddit. I previously mentioned the Sabatier reaction when talking about air recycling. It becomes even more relevant, however, once the Starship has landed on Mars. The Sabatier reaction turns hydrogen and carbon dioxide into water and methane, the latter of which is used as propellant for Starship. Mars's atmosphere contains plenty of carbon dioxide. It's roughly 95% CO2 by mass. You'd either have to bring some hydrogen with you, or you'd need to find water on Mars to turn into hydrogen and oxygen with electrolysis. To obtain water from the glaciers on Mars, you could use the Rodwell process that's used to extract water in Antarctica. You basically pump in a small amount of warm liquid water, which then melts the surrounding ice, which can then be pumped out. If we're able to set up an operation that utilizes this water, we would be able to produce propellant for a return trip without having to continually import more hydrogen from Earth. The general process of using the resources at your destination rather than importing them is referred to as in situ resource utilization. Mass to Mars will still be incredibly expensive for a long time, so reusing Mars's resources as much as possible should be a priority. Even better, if Tesla bots are ready in time for the uncrewed Mars missions later this decade, they could help set up the ISRU stations ahead of time so that we can send the first humans to Mars with much higher confidence that they can actually return after their mission. While the Starship system solves the transportation issue in a very basic sense, a round trip to Mars still takes a fairly long time, especially when you consider the synodic period of 26 months, which is the amount of time between the distance between the two planets is short enough for a transfer between planets. The journey there and back would be roughly 6 months each, but once people arrive to Mars, they'll need to wait for the next transfer window, unless ISRU hasn't produced enough methalox, in which case they'll have to wait an additional synodic period. In total, we're looking at around 2.5 years round trip. We've discussed radiation concerns earlier in the video with regards to the trip to Mars, but what can we do once we're on the surface? Mostly, we'll just go below the surface. We could very well use the starships themselves as habitats, as they'll likely be fairly well shielded from radiation. However, long term, we would definitely need to start branching out and building habitats. What process we'd build them with is a bit too much detail for this video, but in general, as long as we have a few feet of dirt, water, or ice above the habitat, we should be fairly safe. In Dr. Zubrin's AMA, he also addressed this question with his vision of a Mars habitat. You'd have a greenhouse on the surface utilizing sunlight. You'd have an aquarium below the greenhouse with fish intended for food, and human shelters below the aquariums. The plants don't require shielding, and the water absorbs the radiation from the surface. Some research here on Earth involving soil with Mars-like properties indicates that crops will likely grow in soil on Mars, but if that's not the case, we can always just fall back to hydroponics, which requires no soil. I'll talk about this in more detail in a future video, so make sure you subscribe for future videos about the future. That's it for this video. Let me know if I missed anything, and I'll address it in a future video. In the meantime, I would love it if you subscribed to my channel and told some friends about it, especially if they're into futurism and bleeding edge technology. If you have a suggestion for a future topic, let me know in the comments, and go ahead and follow me on Twitter at FutureOptimist, link in the description. I'll see you in the next one.